Okay, hello. I am Dr. Weiss, and my presentation today is on the Gothic and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. I'm going to be talking today about some of the characteristics of the Gothic, which is a kind of subset of Romanticism from the 18th and 19th century. And this in part is an introduction to our study of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Okay, so I think, oftentimes as students, the first thing that we are interested in, if we're interested in anything about reading a literary text, and I hope that we are, is to get into the novel, to figure out what the plot is, what the action is, and perhaps some of these other sort of issues or stories that pertain to the production of the text may not seem as interesting or as relevant. And I would disagree with that position. I think particularly with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the sort of birth, if you will, of this novel is really quite interesting. Mary Shelley began writing this novel when she was 18 years old. And just in terms of the number of masterpieces that were written by authors under the age of 25, there are a lot fewer of them than there were by people that were older than that. All sorts of reasons for that. Maybe they didn't have enough experience, and you write what you know, and all sorts of different things. So Mary Shelley began writing this novel when she was 18 years old. And how did this vision, or how did this dream come to fruition, come to a novel? First of all, the novel was published anonymously in 1818. Why would this be important? Because Mary Shelley was a woman. Mary Shelley, a young woman in the early part of the 19th century. If a novel was published and her name was attached to it, just by being a woman, it might not have been received as well. But there are other reasons for that. Mary Shelley's husband was Percy Shelley, and Percy Shelley was one of the great romantic poets of the 19th century. Percy Shelley wrote a very famous poem, well, many very famous poems. One of my favorites, Ozymandias, perhaps a poem that you might be familiar with. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert, near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and sneer of cold command," and so on and so forth. It's a great poem. It's about Ramses II and how empires fall. Really a condensed poem about how, given enough time, all empires, all kingdoms will fall. And it's entered into the American imagination. Walter White has a reading of Ozymandias during one of the episodes of Breaking Bad. So anyway, Percy Shelley, big deal. Mary Shelley, young woman, a female author. So there are all sorts of reasons as to why the first edition was published anonymously, including that people would think that, of course, Mary Shelley did not write this novel. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. So how did this novel come to fruition? How did the story evolve? So while traveling Europe, her lover and future husband, Percy Shelley, and others competed to write a ghost story, and the monster of Frankenstein was born. So I think this is an interesting story, right? This is a group of friends getting together, and I mean, what do you do at your bonfires? Don't tell me what you do at your bonfires. I probably don't want to know. But let's say you're having a bonfire and you wanted to be creative, and someone says, "Hey, why don't you tell us a scary story?" Which I think is the beginning of a Twilight Zone episode. But anyway, why don't you tell us a scary story? And so this group of friends began making up stories, and Mary Shelley had her turn, and she began to tell a bit of something that she was thinking about. And then that night she had a dream, and she fleshed out more of this story that she was creating, and then the story of Frankenstein was created. So again, there was this question of authorship. How could a young woman, how could a young person, then a young woman, be able to write such a masterpiece story? So really the question of authorship has plagued this novel really up until fairly current scholarship. So one scholar wrote, "The question of whether Mary alone wrote the novel, however, would not die. The answer matters, and not only because scholars who once regarded Frankenstein as merely a potboiler now consider it a progenitor of science fiction, a monument of romantic literature, and a landmark text in gender studies." Why are we still reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? Because it is a good novel? I would absolutely argue that this is a good novel. This is a great novel. As a consumer, to read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is just really interesting. A lot of cool things going on. In terms of its various themes and explorations and different sorts of analyses that we can do, very, very current. So the question of authorship, the stakes have been raised in that even more in our current moment of readership, in our current moment of literary consumerism, because it is thematically a very important novel. There was a study done in 1995 or 1996, I believe, and a scholar looked at the various editions of Frankenstein and I'll just sort of summarize his conclusion. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is about 75,000 words long. This scholar determined that about 4,000 words of the novel were edited or changed or substituted in some way, probably by her husband. So does that settle the question of authorship? I'd like to say once and for all, but nothing ever sort of lies forever. But I think for the most part it does. Percy Shelley, a great writer. Did he help Mary Shelley write the novel? I think the answer to that is no. Did he help edit the novel? Yeah, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 words were changed or altered in some way. And that's what a good editor does, sort of help out a writer making changes in terms of substance and word choice and things like that. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. A review from the 19th century. The churchyard scene in which Frankenstein visits the tombs of his family, his quitting Geneva, and his journey through Tartary to the shores of the frozen ocean, resembles at once the terrible reanimation of a corpse and the supernatural career of a spirit. The scene in the cabin of Walton Ship, the more than mortal enthusiasm and grandeur of the Bean's speech over the dead body of his victim, is an exhibition of intellectual and imaginative power, which we think the reader will acknowledge has seldom been surpassed. Review from 1831. I think a fairly powerful review in advocating for the greatness of this novel. So this novel is both from the Romantic and Gothic traditions. In an earlier presentation, I talked about Romanticism. In the Gothic tradition, we can sort of think about the Gothic as a tradition, as a kind of subset within Romantic literature. So in Romantic literature, there are characteristics that are Gothic, and in Gothic literature, there are characteristics of the larger, I think, Romantic literary tradition. Horace Walpole's 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto, was first called a Gothic story. And this story has somebody, sleeping in a coffin, and there's mystery and all sorts of different things. The Gothic is a style originating from the 12th to the 16th centuries. It's a looking back on various elements from this period of time and incorporating them, I think, in new and mysterious and often violent ways. Some of the characteristics of the Gothic, or things that you would find in a Gothic novel: pointed arches and vaults, flying buttresses, narrow spires, stained glass windows, intricate traceries, and varied details. Its upward movement was meant to suggest heavenward aspiration. The words Goth and Gothic also describe the Germanic tribes, the Goths or the Visigoths, the northern barbarians that came down in the 6th century and help sack parts of the Roman Empire. So the term Gothic is in some ways pejorative. It's, oh, you're talking about Gothic literature. Maybe it's not as serious. Maybe it's more violent. Maybe we're talking about the unconscious and the darkness of the human mind. And this is why I think understanding these broad categories are important. So, we might ask ourselves, why is it important to identify if a novel is Gothic? Well, if we identify a novel as Gothic, then there's a set of characteristics that we can expect. And when you read a novel, or when you, let's say, go to a movie, in the old days when you used to be able to go to movies, you'd go see a rom-com, or you'd go see a thriller, or you'd go see some sort of comedy. You'd go see a Western. There are a set of characteristics in each of those genres that you expect to see in that particular movie or in that particular novel that you might be reading. That familiarity at once informs and, I think, creates a kind of pleasure for you, for me as the consumer, as the reader. So that's the first thing. The second part of that we'll explore in just a moment. The Gothic is characterized by things that are dark. The center image here is an image of flying buttresses, architectural elements that help spread out the weight of a building so that larger buildings could be created. Castles. In these two images, the weather, storms, shadow. Storms and weather play, and this is very much the case in Bram Stoker's late 19th century novel Dracula and in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Storms often foreshadow, they predict, they parallel the internal emotion of various characters in the text, or if the weather is dark, they are a kind of foreshadowing of perhaps of dark things to come later on in the text. So it came to mean barbarian, barbarous. By the 18th century in England, Gothic had become synonymous with the Middle Ages, a period which was in disfavor, chaotic, unenlightened, and superstitious. Characteristics that, that folks, readers, consumers have come to expect in many ways of the Gothic. Continuing, we might have a castle, ruined or intact, something that's haunted, ruined buildings, dungeons, labyrinths, dark corridors and winding stairs, shadows or a beam of moonlight in the blackness, a flickering candle or the only source of light failing, a candle blown out or an electric failure. Extreme landscapes, thick forests, icy wastes, so various extreme weather. What's interesting is that the American Gothic has to work with, in many ways, with what it has. And so what do I mean by that? I'm thinking of a couple of novels. I'm thinking of, or a couple of authors. I'm thinking of Edgar Allan Poe. So Edgar Allan Poe is a early 19th century writer of horror and the short story. He once was thinking about, in one of his essays, he's explicating his thought processes about writing. What is the most tragic thing that you could write about in a novel or in a short story? And he thought to himself, a death. Okay, what kind of death could be the most tragic kind of death? And he said the death of a young woman. And by the way, we have that in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. But what does America not have that, let's say, Europe does have? Old castles, dungeons, all of those sorts of things. So in many ways, American writers had to substitute dungeon-like environments, maybe caves, or elements of the forest which are castle-like. I'm thinking of a particular, it strikes me as a Gothic scene in the later 19th century, Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, when he enters into a glade, and this glade has from a forest, and it has large trees that are like ancient columns and things like that. So American writers had to work with the landscape. American writers had to work with its fairly short history, as opposed to European writers that had castles and crypts and all sorts of other things. Okay, what else do we have? Omens and curses, magic, the supernatural. A passion-driven, willful villain hero or villain. And I think to go back to the second point that I wanted to make, why is it important for us to identify the Gothic? Well, the Gothic, I would argue, explores the extremes of the human experience. Sexual desire, violence, necrophilia, incest, fear, insanity. All of those sorts of things that we might find in the Gothic, we might not find in other texts. Not to say that in order to be a good Gothic novel, we have to have themes of incest, but all of those sort of extreme possibilities are explored because they are all a part of the human experience, part of the human condition. A curious heroine with a tendency to faint and a need to be rescued, often frequently. A hero whose true identity is revealed by the end of the novel. Horrifying or terrifying events or the threat of such happenings. In terms of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we're sort of checking off many, if not all, of these boxes. So considerations for Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. Like I have always advocated, we start with the title, so we learn a little bit about the author. Now, what we don't necessarily want to do is equate what goes on in a text with an author's life. We're not psychoanalyzing. The text in terms of the author's life. Certainly, psychoanalytic theory plays, I think, an important role in the analyses of literary text, particularly maybe in a text like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but within the text. So a little bit of information about the author. And what does the title mean? So Frankenstein. And I always advocate for looking words up in an etymology dictionary. Now the word Stein shows up sort of much later in the 19th century. But Frank, I think, is an interesting word that might help inform in some ways our understanding of the text. The word frank comes from an earlier word from the 15th century. And what does frank mean? Frank means openness and honesty. The things that Dr. Frankenstein, and in many ways the monster of Dr. Frankenstein, have difficulty doing, being honest. And if they were able to do so, if characters in this text were honest with themselves and others, perhaps it'd be a much shorter text because there'd be, it would be happy, and then it would probably be uninteresting to read. The modern Prometheus, sort of the subtitle of this text. Don't skip over this. You say the modern Prometheus, what's this? Pull out your phone, go to the internet, Google Prometheus. Who was Prometheus? Well, Prometheus was a titan from Greek mythology. He was the creator of mankind. He gave mankind fire. He gave mankind fire, transgressing the laws that Zeus, the father god, had put down. This is starting to sound like a framework for the story of Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein creating something perhaps unnatural, something that he might not or should not have done. So Prometheus tricks Zeus, who punishes humans by taking away fire, and Prometheus is chained to a rock. And every day, an eagle, or in some accounts, it's a different bird of prey. Every day, this eagle shows up and eats out the liver of Prometheus as punishment. This is a Greek allusion. An allusion is a reference to another story or another text Yeah, definitely do not overlook these. By stopping and looking these up, doing a little bit of research, this will help. And again, I think that this helps frame the story, gives us an understanding even before you read it or even reread it. The novel is in epistolary form. This is a series of letters. These letters are all written by Robert Walton. The story is told to Robert Walton. The story has already happened. So we start off in the beginning of the novel with Walton on this sea voyage, and then the rest of the novel is an explication primarily from the Dr. Frankenstein, and in some small degree from the words of the monster of Frankenstein himself. So what does this mean? Well, when you tell somebody a story, you're telling the story the way that you want to. So sort of the quintessential, we have a classroom full of students, like in the old days, there would be 20 students in my class, and you tell a story to one student, and they tell the story to the next student. What do you think the story is going to look like by the time it gets to the front, to the last person, to the last listener? It changes. People are going to find some things more interesting than others, right? There's a kind of editing going on. So these are the words from the monster of Frankenstein and from Dr. Frankenstein told to Walton. Walton then is writing these letters to his sister. So the sort of perhaps one of the larger questions for us to think about is, whose story is being told here? Is this the story of the monster of Frankenstein and Dr. Frankenstein? Or is this the story that Walton wants to present, maybe his own story? And in this text, there are a lot of parallels between Walton and the monster of Frankenstein and Walton and Dr. Frankenstein. So this novel is in epistolary form, it is in letter form, and so we have to be concerned and conscientious about the various layers of narrative. Okay. Galvanism was a science on the late 18th and early part of the 19th century, which also helped facilitate Mary Shelley's imagination. What was galvanism? Definition here: to conduct an energetic fluid to the general seat of all impressions, to distribute its influence to the different parts of the nervous and muscular systems, to continue, revive, and if I may be allowed to allow the expression, to command the vital powers. Such are the objects of my researches, and such the advantages which I propose to derive from the action of galvanism. So sort of the anecdotal story is that a corpse, a dead frog, or part of a dead frog, was given an electrical current, and this electrical current went through the muscle and created a spasm. And the early folks who were studying galvanism, Luigi Galvani and others, thought, okay, well, electricity was the basis of animating organic matter. Now, this turned out not to be the case, of course. You could not certainly you could not reanimate. Well, I'm not entirely certain that's an inaccurate statement. But anyway, in general, you cannot reanimate something that has been dead for, let's say, a long period of time. And I guess I'll leave it at that. But this then became the basis of how the monster of Frankenstein was animated from the dead, from various body parts, from various animal parts. And if you've seen a version of any of the movies, this is the sort of climactic moment where the dead comes back to life. And interestingly, in the text, the actual moment where this corpse that's made up of a multitude of various body parts, that actual moment is not nearly as dramatic as it is in cinema. How has Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, how has this novel fared in literature in terms of the Gothic? Well, it hasn't gone away. Some other examples of Gothic literature which follow in the tradition, which follow and predate Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman, The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, and the very famous late 19th century Bram Stoker's Dracula. Bram Stoker's Dracula has what I think is a really fascinating character. And I said earlier that you know, insanity or madness is sort of part of the extreme of the human experience. There's this character in Bram Stoker's Dracula. His name is Renfield. And Renfield spends a fair amount of time, perhaps all of the time, I can't recall exactly, sort of in a cage, in an insane asylum. And nobody listens to him, and this is you know, really in many ways an exploration of society's view of the mad and the insane in the 19th century. But Renfield, through the entirety of his presence, is yelling about Dracula. Dracula's coming, Dracula's coming. And everybody just sort of reacts to Renfield by saying, he's crazy, don't listen to him. Bad move. Renfield was right all along. Interesting character and a very prominent Gothic text. How has Mary Shelley's Frankenstein fared? Again, fared very well, entered into the cultural imagination, entered into the American imagination. It seems almost as if every generation has tried to reimagine the monster of Frankenstein in various ways. I think it would be an interesting analysis to write about, to explore, to create an argument as to why in these different film versions of Frankenstein they appear differently. In the image in the upper left-hand corner, the early 20th century, a sort of classic image of the Boris Karloff's Frankenstein, and all the different various iterations of Frankenstein in movie. And I don't remember what video game this comes from, but in a video game, here is a character, the monster. You could be the monster of Frankenstein as your avatar. In the lower right-hand corner, there's an image of the classic Frankenstein, as you can see from the upper left-hand corner. The classic image of Frankenstein as a tattoo. Yeah, I don't know. I'd be a little bit cautious about that. And tattooing, I think, is very, very interesting, and in various presentations we've looked at some tattoos. But I think we have to be a little bit careful about the choice of tattoos that we might make, only insofar as the literary or movie characters that we might have inked on our bodies, to sort of fully understand these characters. Because the monster of Frankenstein is a very sympathetic character. I think we can identify with the monster of Frankenstein. The monster of Frankenstein also does some pretty awful things. He kills a young woman, he kills a young boy, he kills Dr. Frankenstein's best friend, Henry Clerval. So I think we have to be a little bit careful, because if we're not fully informed about what these characters do, we may be advocating for things that we might not be aware of. Without the Gothic, we don't get Ruby Gloom, cartoon character, I think, from the 90s. We might not get Twilight. Without the Gothic, we don't get Scooby-Doo. And at least one of my boys was hooked on Scooby-Doo for a couple of years. Scooby-Doo. We might not get Interview with a Vampire. We might not get vampires. Without the Gothic, we don't get things like The Walking Dead. So we have, as a culture, really as a world culture, a fascination with ghosts. And what are ghosts? Things that come from the past that will not go away. Sort of the intersection there of psychoanalytic theory, right? Things from the past that won't go away. So ghosts, poltergeists, zombies, that the dead will not rest. This comes from, in many ways, from the Gothic. Other Gothic images for us to quickly take a look at, that's a back tattoo. And that is pretty cool. It looks pretty expensive. Looks like a cathedral or a castle, and it's also a skull. You know, Gothic-themed motorcycles, and perhaps without the Gothic, we don't get one of my favorite bands from the 80s. Does anybody know? Oh, there's nobody here. It's just me in a room by myself, so nobody can answer. That's The Cure. And without the Gothic, perhaps without Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we don't have The Cure. Okay. Thank you. All right, Scott.